Hello and welcome to an exciting edition of Literati today. I'm your host, Joseph Ike, and with me today is Muhammed Sani Abdullahi, most affectionately known as Dattijo here in Kaduna and almost everywhere else. In fact, I think more people know you as Dattijo, such that I'm guessing when you tell people your name is Muhammad, they're wondering, wait, who? What? But then Dattijo, everyone knows. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Joseph.
Let's dive right into it. I think we know you as an economist, a development specialist, a politician. When did you become a writer?
My professional life has led me to do a lot of writing, but mostly policy documents, long, boring, sometimes policy documents. But I'm a very avid reader. In my free time, I love to read non-fiction, fiction, everything. Okay. And so probably 4 years ago, after attending a number of book events, like the Kaba Fest and a lot, decided to try. And I honestly thought that I would be done with my first book in 6 months.
Mm-hmm. Most people do.
That was the time frame that I put in, but it's taken 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then after 4 years, we have this marvelous piece of art, I would call it, titled Disruption. Now, everything about this book is worth talking about. The problem is we don't have so much time. And I know it's not yet, as at the recording, it's not yet publicly available, but probably by broadcast time, it will be available at bookstores all across the country, hopefully all across the continent. Yeah. But tell us about that title. Why did you pick that title?
Well, I think that this is essentially a book around governance and development. And I wrote it because of what I personally experienced as a slightly young person being thrust into very significant roles, both internationally and locally here in Kaduna. And I realized that to make any real progress in the lives of people, we had to really try and change programmed ways of behavior that have lingered on for decades, that have stopped us from, quote unquote, being great. And in the previous development discussion, it's been a discussion around reform. But I think what this book tries to show is that many times reforms are slow and even too painful. It's like taking off a Band-Aid. Sometimes it's better to just yank it off. And so the disruption here talks about the shock that's required to build something that's much better. That significant shift in a way of thinking, in a way of doing things that allows nation states to really make progress. And so I use within the book a number of examples to show how, with disruption, we can get to a higher level of development much quicker. And then the book also, using a lot of humor and personal stories, also tries to show the disruption within my personal life that has led us to my ability to make progress within my professional life as well.
Yeah, because I was going to mention, it's less of a how-to book. Yeah. It's almost a hybrid between I would want to call it a memoir, but it's not a biography in the traditional sense. Yeah. The storytelling is remarkable because it actually pulls the audience in. And I think someone mentioned earlier that it's very unusual for an economist to have this kind of unique, or rather engaging storytelling. No offense to economists, but they're not necessarily the most interesting people to listen to, especially when the topic is economical. Now, the book starts off with you making a decision to swim in the opposite direction. Yeah. By that I mean, I guess the narrative in Africa is that when you get good enough, you grow from your local setting to a national setting, and then you move on to the international platform. And that's, where the height of your career blooms. You were already at the UN in New York, which I guess for most people, is where you should be at the pinnacle, and made the decision not to come back on a national level, but to head all the way down to, I guess, what would be mostly, not even to Lagos or Abuja, the typical destinations in Lagos, or rather in Nigeria, but to Kaduna. What were your concerns in making that decision, and what was the overriding thing in your mind that said, with all these concerns, this thing has to get done?
Well, I mean, Joseph, I think that as a development economist, as you mentioned, that was the dream, right? To end up, my office was literally 5 doors away from the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon at the time, and I had the opportunity to sit in meetings every single week with heads of states, ambassadors, and other people that determine development, right, globally. But what I realized very quickly was that although I was here at the pinnacle discussing and shaping global development, what really my passion was to implement, right? To see all these things that we've talked about, like the globally agreed goals, really working in practice and changing the lives of people, right? And I felt like while we had the opportunity to make significant amount of contributions globally with the United Nations, and at the time working on the Sustainable Development Goals, where really the impact would be much more important would be implementing it at the local level. And at the time in 2015 when I made this decision, Nigeria was going through significant amount of turmoil. Kaduna, for example, had a bombing almost every week, right? And I remember always, whenever I spoke to my mother, who still lives here, and she tells me she's going to the market or going to a wedding, I would not rest until she came back home safely, because weddings and markets were really targets for terrorists. So really convincing my wife and kids at that time to leave Manhattan and jump into sort of the war front, basically, because that was what it was at the time, was the biggest task. But I'm quite happy that we did, because it's evident now Kaduna is much better. I don't say it's because of me, but because of the collective effort and the team that the governor was able to put together. And that's why really, for me, documenting this and seeing it from our lens about how we needed to look at new ways to get data, how we needed to do infrastructure, how we needed to communicate policies, how we needed to do education, is really something that's not discussed a lot, because typically people do development from the top, and nobody really hears from the actors at the front of the battle. And we use one brush to always say, oh, uneducated public servants in the north of Nigeria. But with writing this book, I'm hoping that even our international partners would understand that the challenges really that are faced at that local level are much beyond what is easily assumed, right? And they sometimes are also part of the problem. And it's very, very important that these things are appreciated and understood for what they are. And that's why I really sat down to see if I could pen Disruption.
You made a bold assertion at the start of the book, and I think you just mentioned something about it. At the point where you made the decision to head back to Kaduna, there was a lot of crisis, violence ongoing in Kaduna. And your first major assertion at the start of the book is that these problems weren't religious, like they were painted, they weren't ethnic, they weren't anything else, but they were emphatically as a result of economic mismanagement. Isn't this just a case of, to the person with a hammer, everything seems like a nail? How could you make such a claim so boldly and emphatically that this is at the root of this? Where did that come from?
Well, I think that living and working in Kaduna over these past 7 years, you can almost every single day show where communities that are prosperous communities that have opportunity, communities where there are jobs, are much less likely to be also communities where violence is always perpetrated. Whenever we get the call of violence or people, it's mostly in rural, deep rural communities where there's a lot of poverty. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in the rich communities, but the larger percentage, herder-farmer clashes, all these issues that happen usually stem from depravity, right? And I mean, I do provide some data in the book to really back up these claims. So my point is that with enhanced economic management, you don't eradicate it, but you bring it to a very low minimum. And so what you're dealing with after that are the ideologues, right? Where it's really not an issue of banditry and kidnapping for ransom or communal violence, but you're dealing with terrorist groups. And it's important to be able to analyze these groups for their motivations. And that's how you ultimately get to a solution.
Great. Okay, and then, I mean, the next logical question is, so where does the data come from? And because one was going to ask, how generalizable is this idea that at the root of a lot of communal instability is economic mismanagement? How much could we generalize this across the African continent? And then where do we get reliable data to back this up? But we'll get to this right after we get back from our break. So we'll take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. When we come back, we'll pick up on those two questions. And we're back. If you're just joining us, my guest, Muhammed Sani, it's very difficult for me to say your full normal name, so I'll just say Dattijo, is the writer of the book Disruption. And we've been talking about, we started off a very interesting conversation on how at the root of a good sizable number of the communal instability we have in Kaduna and possibly across Africa has economic mismanagement at its root. And my question to you was, how do we get reliable data to back this up? Because that's the next subject that you address in the book.
Well, I think it's very simple actually, because globally there is enough data to show you that more prosperous countries have less amount of violence, less amount of quote unquote, I wouldn't say crime, but I think the kind of violence that we're facing now in the Sahel region and the rest of other parts of Africa. And it's because we have a huge youth bulge, right? And we're facing a huge risk of it becoming a demographic curse, right? Because these young people are not engaged meaningfully in any economic activity. Communities, large number of communities where you go and people are lying idle and not doing anything, provide ready fodder for these either terrorist groups or for communal clashes or all of that. Creates that opportunity. And there is a chapter within Disruption where I discuss significantly the issue of creating opportunities. Yeah. And really that's the core of it, to ensure that our youth bulge becomes a demographic dividend rather than a curse.
So at some point in the book, you talk about this Polish GovTech model. I mean, thinking about how businesses could provide such an immense opportunity for the development of a community. And it just got me thinking about other things that you'd propose in the book, particularly one that sticks out to me is the Polish GovTech model. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that what I tried to do was to really look at various lessons from across the globe on where these things have worked. Now, the Polish have been able really to develop their governance around technology, right? And this stems from ownership from the highest level. So the Prime Minister's office is where provides that political will to ensure that the entirety of government runs on some sort of technological platforms that bring technology down to the people, right? And they've been able to use that to deliver service, right, in a way that's replicable for our continent, right? And particularly they've done it with open engagement, because what usually happens with government is that government sees itself as a supplier, as an all-knowing, all-seeing. Whereas when you open up and engage your citizens, you get much, much more, right? It brings, one of the things that we've adopted, for example, from that model was from our monitoring and evaluation session, which with the eyes and ears, right? Where we crowdsourced support from the public to monitor government projects, right? And this has huge amount of potential when used, scaled up, nationwide, first of all, and even continent-wide, right? Because one of the major issues that bedevil projects across Africa is the lack of completion, right? Lack of monitoring. And we've failed in that because we've tried as much as possible to use government heads, government personnel to do that. With Eyes and Ears, what we built out of GovTech was an app where every single citizen of the state could download the state's budget. The app would take you to where that school or hospital or road was supposed to be located. You could take pictures, and those things would end up right on the desk of the governor. So we cut out the middleman, right, completely, and we're able to really bring that, contractor quality, contractor monitoring from the desk of the citizen right to the desk of the governor. So the entire Polish model is around also how do you integrate a lot of technology? How do you utilize the voices, the expertise of young people, of which the continent has a lot, to really bring service to the people across Kaduna and hopefully the continent.
Do you feel that young people have just lost interest in issues of government, governance, development, across the continent? I mean, of course, in Nigeria, you mentioned that we have a teeming population of young people. Do you get the sense that they're just no longer interested in any of this?
Definitely. It's not only in Nigeria, but across the world. I believe that if you look at the citizen perception of government, and there's an index, in the US and other countries, they use the Pew Index, which actually measures citizen perception of government and the trustworthiness between the two. In Africa, Afrobarometer surveys come out frequently to see how trustworthy the government, the citizens think government is. And this is a major, major issue. When we came in, for example, 18%, only 18% of African citizens, right, trusted their governments, which means granularly, like if you walk into a room as a government official, you have less than 20% of people that are going to believe anything you say, right? And it's a huge issue, and this is based on decades of broken promises, right, which any public sector, individual government must try to rebuild. And one person that breaks it for everybody, right? And so really what I've seen over the last 7 years in Kaduna is a rebuilding of that trust. It takes a long time because it has to do with promises that were made by successive governments, but you can see that trust quotient is glowing slightly upwards.
I agree. I agree that's the case in Kaduna, but in the country as a whole, would you make the same assertion?
Definitely, I would say that there's a huge amount of apathy from young people around leaders who are elected or appointed, right? And this is really because if you take 18-year-olds in Nigeria today, what they've known is just a life that has been bedeviled by terrorists and bandits and kidnappers. This is something that wasn't there 30 years ago, right? And so their reality is significantly different from And this is what so they don't trust that government is going to be there. They've come in at a time where the economy has really been hurting. And so the resources that were available to governments in the past, where they will roll out significant amounts of economic and social infrastructure, is just not available now. Mm-hmm. So they're used to governments being unable to handle their responsibilities of building infrastructure, even all the way down to paying salaries. Yeah. So that that lack of synergy between the two groups has given birth to, and you see them very vocal on social media, a very, very distrusting public, right? And they're able to, which is also something that's happened over the last 2 decades, they're able to call out leadership in a way that 30 years ago we couldn't, right? Because you would just go missing.
I think that's a good point for us to take a quick break, and when we're back, we'll talk about the other issue, which is resources, and that's discussed extensively in the book. How do we manage the scarce resources that we have? After the break.
News Central TV, Africa's #1 storyteller, has come with the best of both worlds. With a combination of news app and live TV, we ensure that you keep track of the latest headlines, breaking news, and in-depth analysis from professional journalists from around the continent. Download the News Central TV app on Android and iOS and get started today. Don't forget to follow us on News Central's social media platforms. News Central, Africa first.
And we're back. If you're just joining us, my guest is Muhammed Sani Dattijo, and we're talking about his new book, Disruption, and talking about some of the challenges that we face across the continent and how some of the issues discussed in the book could help to begin to come about some sort of transformation in the landscape of things. You mentioned before we went on the break resources, and another key theme that your book dwells on across several chapters is how do we manage these resources? You titled one section, Show Me Your Budget and I'll Tell You Who You Are. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, I think that, transiting from the political process into governance, many political leaders talk about what they want to do when they get to office, right? And some of them tell you they want to focus on education, want to focus on healthcare, so many other very nice sounding priorities, and they're essentially elected because of these things. But there's no tool that really is the mechanism to achieving these aspirations than the budget, right? Many times people look at the budget as just a list of contracts. The budget is the fundamental heart of any political agenda. And anything that is not within that budget does not form part of the priority of that administration. So whenever you see a political leader elected and he does his first budget cycle and none of the things that he's talked about show up, then it really shows the huge disconnect between what he's saying and what he really intends to do, right? Many times political leaders themselves are hoodwinked because they do not understand that the budget is how they translate their political agendas. And so you find that you end up with different governments facially, but fundamentally the same spending patterns, which really does not does not differentiate one government from the other.
So I guess that's how we end up with a book that has a narrative style that is more reminiscent of a writer, maybe even a fictional writer, than an economist, because it seems like you're more interested in having a conversation about these topics with an audience that, could be anyone. I mean, you're sitting having a conversation about these very many different topics, and it comes across that way. But you mentioned painstaking work. So how were you able to pull this off with, you clearly weren't unemployed when this was happening. You're a family man, you have so many other responsibilities. So how do you pull something like this off?
I think that's why it's taken 4 years. Because really I wrote a lot during the lockdowns. And because these are topics that I feel very passionate about, right? Whenever I hear something interesting, I write it down, right? So if you look at my iPad, for example, I have a huge pages of quotes from many different people that I've worked with, right? And especially the governor, because he says a lot of interesting things all the time. I've worked with Amina Mohammed, she says a lot of interesting things. So I've always had this habit of always putting things down. And so, and I've always had the habit also of holding these blank notebooks. So if you go to my library, for example, you'd see that I've gone through probably about 45 of those books. And so I'm able, and I never thought that I would use them to write a book, but I was able to use them quickly to be able to go back to dates and times where things happened. And so putting it together, I mean, wasn't easy, especially the first couple of drafts, because not only was this is the first book I've written.
Yeah.
I was also very concerned about not making it too technical, because I realized that, you know, based on my line of work and writing policy documents, people could get very, very turned off. So I think I started the shell with 10 stories that I really wanted to tell that were completely not governance related, but happened to me while I was in the office.
So the last thing, because unfortunately we have to wrap up our discussion, what do you hope happens when this book finally hits the shelves and people start reading?
Well, I mean, I was appointed commissioner, which is subnational minister of budget and planning. I was 35 years old. I was probably one of the youngest across the country. And when I came in, there were many, many things that I wish I had known about government, about subnational governance, about different lessons across Africa. And so I feel like the first person that I'm writing this for is for people like me, who usually come into government thrown into the deep end and really just want somebody to talk to in the middle of the night. I didn't have anybody, so hopefully other people will have the book. I think the second group of people is our international partners, because I came in from that space, and I know a lot of the misconceptions that are held around developing countries, and to wave it away as either corruption or lack of capacity or just not willingness to do things. And when you go in, when you look under the hood, you find out that there are actually a number of constraints that really would take not much to unlock, but are just not being looked at. So I think these kind of people I'm writing is for them as well. And then just students of public policy, or if you just want to have a laugh, because I tried to put in
I mean, there's a lot of quips like this story we just heard that are in the book. Thank you so much, Muhammed Sani, for spending time with us today. We look forward to having you when the next book is out. I'm guessing there's 45 notebooks, so I know there's more books to be had from there. And thank you so much for spending your time with us today on Literati. Tune in same time next week. We have another guest and another book.